International news now.
All right, so today we're going to do three things. First, we're going to provide some background on the conflict over Ukraine, concentrating on why Russia invaded Ukraine, why the United States and its European allies have supported Ukraine with substantial levels of military aid. Second, we're going to examine the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was an important ally to Putin a while back and leader of the paramilitary Wagner Group. He later became Putin's most prominent critic, leading a failed coup attempt in June of 2023. And now this week, he has likely died in a plane crash that many suspect was an assassination. And on the daily podcast that I was listening to this morning, one of the commentators said one of the most interesting things or telltale things that Putin said in his press conference yesterday was that he spoke of Prigozhin in the past tense, which was probably a confirmation that he knew he was dead.
Yeah.
So third, we're going to talk about Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russia, which started about 2 months ago, but has achieved very few significant territorial gains. We'll discuss the strategy and why Ukraine has experienced such a long and costly fight against Russian defenses so far.
And these things kind of fit together because one of the reasons I'd say that Putin could get rid of Prigozhin at this time is because he's feeling more confident about the war in Ukraine than and Russia's sort of leverage and position in it than he's felt in a long time because of this stalled counteroffensive. And so he could get rid of Prigozhin because he thinks that Russia is going to maintain some sort of stalemate at the very least that can get him to the next sort of stage here. And I'm thinking that he's looking for a long war of attrition, that if he eliminates all of his enemies, including Prigozhin and the far right, he's going to be able to keep it going.
Yeah. Wear down the Ukrainians, wear down the Europeans in their support of Ukraine, and wear down the United States in its support of Ukraine, particularly with the possibility that U.S. interests could change significantly if a new president is elected in November of next year.
So all of these issues we're going to talk about in detail, kind of separately, but we wanted to kind of bring them all together up front to show how they interact and tie together. And so, three things: background of the war, right? Prigozhin's death, and then Ukraine's counteroffensive. So I guess we'll start now with background. And so, in starting or talking about some background on this conflict, we're going to begin with Russia's goals in launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So this is we're talking about a conflict that has been going on for more than right around a year and a half. And so we want to give you some background just in case you haven't been paying a lot of close attention to this conflict. And so the first piece of background we need to explore are the reasons why Russia and its president, Vladimir Putin, wanted to risk an all-out invasion of Ukraine in the first place. And by all accounts, this was a war of choice for Russia. There was no imminent threat of aggression from Ukraine toward Russia, or even really a crisis, a political crisis that threatened to significantly change the international status of Ukraine. Ukraine was not, in February 2022, about to formally join NATO or the European Union for that matter. Rather, what Putin had were long-term goals for greater control over Ukraine's foreign policy and ultimately its domestic policy. And that is what was really the driving force behind this invasion. And so these goals that Putin has regarding Ukraine can be grouped into three intersecting ambitions that represent increasingly deeper levels of Russian control over Ukraine. So the first goal, and the one that he sort of concentrated on in the buildup toward this conflict, was that Putin took military action against Ukraine to prevent that country from joining NATO. And so Putin has long seen the expansion of NATO after the end of the Cold War as threatening to Russia's national security interests. And Putin not only wants assurances that Ukraine will not join NATO now while he is in power and is capable of leveraging Russia's military and using threats of force to prevent that occurrence, but he wanted assurances in the future when the balance of power could change and Russia would have less leverage to stop this development. And so from his perspective, at least, he decided that a successful military invasion that installed a pro-Russian government in Ukraine would provide this permanent solution to the prospect at some future date of Ukraine joining NATO. Now, second, Putin also believes that a Western-oriented Ukraine that is economically and culturally tied to the West is also a threat to Russia, whether or not it's formally a part of NATO. Thus, Putin has an ambition to reestablish Russia's sphere of influence over Ukraine by guaranteeing, and that sphere of influence would guarantee that Ukraine and its government and literally its society would be subservient to Russia's security and economic interests. And the model here, I would argue, would be another neighboring country for Russia, Belarus, which has long been led by a dictator that takes its orders from Russia. So Putin wanted a Ukraine that was under the influence, so to speak, of Russia, and an invasion would accomplish this goal as well. And finally, in the kind of biggest set of ambitions, Putin has also argued that Ukraine is, in his words, an artificial country, that it doesn't really have any historical foundations, right? And that Russians and Ukrainians share a common historical, ethnic, and in his words, even spiritual common identity. And he wants then to reunite the Russian and Ukrainian peoples in this vision of creating a greater Russia that also includes Ukraine and Belarus probably in this grand scheme. And this ethnic appeal also argues that ethnic Russians, which form a large minority, particularly in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, face discrimination under the Ukrainian government and need protection from the Russian state. And so that even broader sort of imperial ambition to reestablish a greater Russia, a more imperial Russia that includes an independent Ukraine, is all part of this picture.
So now we want to discuss briefly why the United States and the West has been supporting Ukraine. It was not a foregone conclusion that the United States and its Western allies would remain united and provide sufficient economic and military support for Ukraine. Many experts expected Western countries to react with strongly worded denunciations of Russian actions, but little else. After all, Russia's 2014 military intervention in Ukraine and its annexation of Crimea produced economic sanctions, but not much else. However, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine seemed to cross a red line that prompted much stronger Western reactions. The Biden administration managed to lead a coalition of Western states that imposed some of the strongest economic sanctions ever on a major country, and more importantly, substantial military aid that allowed Ukraine to defend itself against the much larger Russian military. So what did the U.S. and its Western allies see as their vital interests in a war between Russia and Ukraine? Like Russia, the Western alliance supporting Ukraine has a series of intersecting goals that represent both narrow, short-term goals and longer-term, broad ambitions. First, for the United States and Europe, Ukraine represents the front line of the containment against Russian aggression toward its neighbors. Putin not only wants to prevent NATO from expanding and admitting Ukraine, but he has also called for a rollback of NATO military structures in other parts of Eastern Europe. Newer members of NATO, such as Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, who were part of the Soviet Union until 1991, are particularly vulnerable to future Russian aggression. Western governments feared that a successful Russian invasion of Ukraine could lead to future military interventions in other parts of Eastern Europe. A failure of NATO remaining united to help defend Ukraine with military aid could signal weakness and an unwillingness of NATO members to defend other members with military force if threatened by Russia.
Yeah, and if you remember when this whole crisis started and Putin was threatening to invade Ukraine, President Biden made it very explicit that the United States and NATO would defend every inch of NATO territory. But this test over Ukraine, quite naturally raised this question that, well, if the West sits back and watches Ukraine fall to Russian aggression, what about, Lithuania? Mm-hmm. Lithuania has a bunch of ethnic Russians in it too. Mm-hmm. Would the United States and this alliance actually use force to defend them? Mm-hmm. And so that was
and one of the things the Biden administration do was to put more U.S. troops
right.
in these Baltic countries to signal that, yes, the United States would defend Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland if Russia expanded the war beyond Ukraine. Right. So second, the Biden administration has also framed the conflict over Ukraine in broader moral terms and as an effort to protect international norms. The United States needed to defend Ukraine, a fledgling new democracy, from aggression by an authoritarian Russia. Moreover, the post-Cold War security arrangement in Europe is based on the international norm of national sovereignty, and the United States could not allow Russia to change borders and wipe out sovereign countries like Ukraine through military force. Third, the fight over Ukraine was meant to send a signal to other authoritarian countries, namely China, who have their own designs on neighboring countries. China views neighboring Taiwan as a renegade Chinese province that needs to be reunited with the mainland. A successful Russian invasion of Ukraine that prompted little Western resistance could have signaled to China that it could invade Taiwan and suffer few repercussions. Other authoritarian countries might also conclude that the United States and the West were not willing to defend the international order that they themselves had created.
And the opposite's really true here too, is that a robust reaction and a real show of strength by the West to stop Russia from successfully trying to just swallow up Ukraine gives pause to a China that has, in the past, given signals that it could invade Taiwan to reincorporate that country. And so those are the signals that it's trying to lay out. So the final point I want to make in this background section here is simply how important this particular conflict is and why you, as citizens of the United States and observers now of U.S. foreign policy, should care about it. And so the first thing I would say is that the war in Ukraine, from my perspective at least, is a historical inflection point. It is more than just a regional conflict between two countries in Eurasia, Russia and Ukraine. It is a conflict that has ramifications for the whole political system. And as such, how the conflict is resolved and who sort of wins out in that battle over the status of Ukraine will have important consequences for U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has threatened the post-1991, I should say, international settlement, that settlement after the end of the Cold War. And if Russia is ultimately successful in its invasion of Ukraine, then that settlement would be fundamentally changed. And a U.S.-led European security order, really, that is dominated by Western democracies would be severely undermined, if not completely ended. And so that's the first reason why this is a war and a conflict that has repercussions that go much beyond the status of Ukraine as an independent country. And that the war in Ukraine is also a test of strength and solidarity of the West. And as such, then, how this war goes will have a lot of implications for how well the West can continue to manage and control the international order in terms of aligning it with its interests. And so far, the West has performed relatively well as a united front. And consequently, it has come away, again, at this point, stronger. NATO is more united than ever, and even larger now because it's added Finland and, in a matter of a month or two, Sweden to its military coalition. And so NATO looks stronger rather than weaker, and that was not what Vladimir Putin expected in launching this war in the first place. He thought that NATO would sort of split and crumble, and he got the exact opposite. Now, of course, the war is not over. A lot of things can happen, and so the Western advantages that have been accumulating here as Russia has struggled and U.S.-led military and support and economic sanctions seem to have helped Ukraine resist. If things go the other way, then these Western advantages could be reversed as well. And finally, aid to Ukraine is one of the most important and arguably divisive foreign policy issues facing the United States right now. And so the Biden administration sees its handling of the war in Ukraine as one of its biggest foreign policy successes. And for much of the war, there were large majorities of Americans who supported large-scale military aid to Ukraine, supported Ukraine in general as the victim of unprovoked aggression by Russia, and was pretty satisfied with how the Biden administration handled this crisis. However, that's beginning to change, and I want to point out two particular items of division. Within the Republican Party, party leaders are divided over aid for Ukraine. And so if you watch the primary debate, you could see these divisions pretty clearly. On one side, there were candidates like Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, Mike Pence, who argued that the United States needs to continue to support Ukraine with robust military aid. They see Russia and its aggression against Ukraine as a threat to U.S. security interests, and if anything, they've criticized the Biden administration for not doing enough to help Ukraine fight against Russia, or not taking steps soon enough to provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to be successful in this war. But on the other side, there were candidates like Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, that have called for an end for U.S. military aid to Ukraine and a change in policy in which there would be some sort of push to exchange territory that Russia has illegally occupied in Ukraine for some sort of security guarantees in Ukraine. Donald Trump, who wasn't at the debate, also has a position that puts lots of conditions on aid to Ukraine. Now, besides those elite divisions in which you've got different messages coming out of different parts of the Republican Party, there is perhaps an even bigger challenge for the Biden administration moving forward, because the initially strong support for Ukraine has declined. And this often happens in wars and in military interventions. Initially popular wars become less popular over time, usually because of high levels of casualties. In this case, there are no American casualties because there are no American troops in the mix here. But there is a growing fatigue, if you will, about U.S. military aid going to Ukraine. And so a recent poll conducted in July 2023 shows that now 51% of Americans say that the United States has already done enough to help Ukraine, while only 48% say it should do more. Still a pretty even split, right? But more importantly, and perhaps more alarmingly for the Biden administration, which wants to continue this military aid and support for Ukraine, 55% of Americans now say that Congress should not authorize further funding for military aid to Ukraine, and only 45% say that Congress should authorize this funding. Now, there's a huge partisan differences, right? And so I think in this poll, there are 62% of Democrats who favor continued aid, and only 28% of Republicans who feel the same way. And then there's like 44% independents. And so this is something to kind of follow as this debate becomes politicized during a presidential and congressional campaign.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize here that even if there isn't a change in administrations, there's not next November,
Right.
These poll numbers suggest that there's a coming change in U.S. policy, and that the support is not indefinite. And so this is also going to factor into military strategy on the ground.
And this is something that plays into a subject we're going to get to in a few minutes about this counteroffensive. I mean, the really big implication of a stalled counteroffensive by Ukraine is this growing realization that this might be a long war of attrition, that Ukraine can't achieve its maximal goals very easily and very quickly of pushing Russian forces all the way out of Ukrainian territory. And that's going to be a harder sell to not just the American public, but publics in Western Europe and the like. So.
Okay, so let's move on to the recent news of the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. We're going to start this section with the clip from the PBS NewsHour, and so let's go ahead and roll that clip now.
We return now to our other lead story, a plane crash in Russia that could have ramifications around the world. A jet went down today en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg. The airline said it was carrying the head of the infamous Wagner mercenary group.
Outside of Moscow, a plane falls from the sky. The possible fiery fate of a former Kremlin soldier turned traitor. Yevgeny Prigozhin rose from the St. Petersburg underworld to become known as Vladimir Putin's chef, thanks to Kremlin catering contracts. He helped cook up the 2016 U.S. disinformation campaign from this St. Petersburg building. And then Prigozhin's Kremlin catering turned violent. His paramilitary empire Wagner Group deployed thousands of mercenaries to a dozen countries to do the Kremlin's bidding. In Ukraine, Wagner helped Russia capture the center of Bakhmut in the war's longest and deadliest battle.
Thanks
to Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin for giving us the high honor to defend our motherland.
But he also turned his guns toward Russia. He questioned the war's goals and blamed military leaders by name for his men's deaths.
We have a 70% shortage of ammunition. Shoigu, Gerasimov, where is the ammunition?
And then his most notorious act, a coup attempt and march to Moscow. It was aborted, but Putin called it, quote, a stab in the back.
Excessive ambition and vested interests have led to treason, a betrayal of the country, its people, and its cause.
So at the time of this lecture, Russian authorities have not yet officially confirmed that Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed in the crash of his private jet on Wednesday. There are some rumors about body doubles for Prigozhin being killed instead. I wouldn't pay any attention to that. A Pentagon spokesman stated that Prigozhin is likely dead, according to U.S. intelligence. President Putin talked about him in the past tense. He's dead.
So we're gonna go out on a limb and confirm for you that it's clear that they want to be careful and the like. But yeah.
So who was Yevgeny Prigozhin, and why is his death getting so much attention? Prigozhin was a Russian oligarch and political fixer for Putin. After spending some time in Soviet prisons, he started in the restaurant business and ultimately built a fortune as a caterer with huge state contracts.
He started with a hot dog stand.
Oh, really?
And I would not recommend eating hot dogs in St. Petersburg or any place in Russia. They're not good. But anyway.
That didn't hold him back, at least temporarily. So he met Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg in the 1990s. And once Putin became president, Prigozhin became a political insider who used his wealth to help the state. For example, it was Prigozhin who supposedly came up with the idea and led the program of Russian interference in the 2016 US elections. Later, he became the leader of the infamous paramilitary Wagner group. This group projected Russian military power around the world, particularly in Africa. Beginning in 2014, the Wagner group played a central role in Russia's war in Ukraine. It was only in 2022, during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that Prigozhin stepped out of the shadows and became a well-known political figure in his own right. This is when things took a turn for Prigozhin. While he avoided publicly criticizing Putin, he became a vocal critic of military leadership in Russia and the war in Ukraine. He called out Russian military leaders and accused them of consciously sabotaging his Wagner group. Putin did little to rein in Prigozhin, and many commentators felt that Prigozhin's critical statements about military leaders helped to shield Putin from responsibility for problems with the Ukraine war. But then Prigozhin took the shocking step of launching a failed coup attempt in June of 2023. He led a portion of his Wagner forces out of Ukraine and into Russia. They first captured a southern city, Rostov-on-Don. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Don is just a river, and so it's Rostov on the River Don.
All right. Thank you. And then started to travel in a caravan toward Moscow. It's been a long time since I had Russian, 25 years in fact. So there were a few tense hours as the Wagner forces came within a couple hundred miles of Moscow before reversing course and ended the challenge following a deal with Putin, ended up being a bad deal, brokered by the president of Belarus to spare Prigozhin's life temporarily.
So let's talk a little bit about this deal. Yeah. So here's Prigozhin. He, without much resistance at all and this is, Rostov-on-Don was the sort of military headquarters for the whole Ukrainian military expedition, right? And so there's a lot of soldiers there. No resistance. He captures Rostov, right? And his Wagner forces are sort of welcomed in these, at least publicly, videos that were posted to social media and the like as heroes, right? And so there was also a photo and some video of him talking to the military leaders of Rostov-on-Don in friendly terms, like he was, they were supportive, right?
And think about this, right? So they launch a caravan out of it on the way to Moscow, and they're not stopped.
Yeah, and they're not stopped. Not only
by the Russian military that's there, that's supposedly loyal to Putin.
And so this happens on a Saturday, at least here in the United States. And so I'm watching this on CNN, and
I was at a baseball game. We started texting back and forth. Yeah.
And as it goes up this highway, it's getting closer and closer. And then the reports from Moscow is that there's no real defenses of Moscow. There's some city police and a few sort of government guard that protects Putin. And then there were some reports that turned out to not to be true, that Putin left Moscow because he was under threat. It looked like this was going to be a battle in Moscow between Wagner forces and whatever military could get cobbled together. The caravan goes. There are some military units with helicopters and stuff that tried to stop them, and the Wagner forces shot them down and killed Russian soldiers. And then, of course, we're watching this in real time, and then all of a sudden it stops, and then the reports start coming in that there was a deal brokered and they're not going to do it. And so, and the deal was some sort of amnesty, not only for Prigozhin, but for his Wagner forces, that they were going, brokered by the president of Belarus, and so the Wagner forces could leave Russia, go to Belarus, be provided some sort of safe haven that would protect them from retribution. And they needed this because Putin had already gone on television, called Prigozhin a traitor, and this is treason, and signaled that, we're going to, eliminate these traitors. And then what, in the aftermath of trying to explain what happened, what most, analysts argue is that all of these sorts of coup attempts are always a risk for the coup plotters, because what they're hoping to do is launch something that then other elites and other, especially military leaders, will join. They'll say, okay, somebody finally trying this, we're going to jump on this bandwagon and we're going to remove the leader. None of that happened. Everybody just sat pat. They didn't condemn it, but they didn't join it. And because he didn't get anybody to join it, he knew it was going to fail, and it was going to end. And so, there was an attempt then to diffuse it by the leader of Belarus, I think in part just to de-escalate what could have been a pretty bloody conflict that probably would have ended really badly for the Wagner forces, but also potentially for the Russian state. And so that's why and how that got diffused. As we said, this exit plan was always seen as sooner or later, he was going to pay the ultimate price for this challenge to Putin. But it was a really interesting and important development because it did make Putin seem and appear weak, because he called out Prigozhin as a traitor, but then he let him live. And not only did he let him live, in the days that followed, he also met with him in Moscow, and it looked like Prigozhin was not only going to survive, but also continue to play a role in the Russian state, despite the fact that he led what they kept calling a mutiny, which I find that term they weren't on a boat. So it's not, but it was a coup attempt. And so, so that's the way that turned out. Carry on. So this is the red line, arguably, right? That coup attempt, even though he had an exit strategy, right? He had a deal that at least at the time saved him and the Wagner forces. That deal wasn't a long-lasting one. And it was because Prigozhin crossed this red line, challenged Putin, made Putin look weak. And thus his days were most people predicted, his days were numbered anyway. It was just a matter of time. Okay, so we've got here this big news story. One of Putin's closest allies turns on Putin, challenges his power, and then finds himself dead. That might not be very surprising given what we know about how Putin has historically handled opposition figures and those who challenge him. There's a long list of people who have been poisoned, pushed out of windows, and the like for crossing Putin. And so even though this isn't that surprising, and there's still we don't know if he actually did it, I'm pretty convinced that Putin was behind this. This was assassination, and Putin was behind it. Let's break down exactly what this means for Russian domestic politics. And we're going to start again with another clip from the PBS NewsHour about the ramifications or implications of this, of Prigozhin's death.
Putin want Prigozhin dead, and do you believe he could be behind this if Prigozhin is dead?
Well, I think Putin would have enough reason to want Prigozhin dead. After all, Prigozhin, challenged the Kremlin. He challenged the conduct of the war. He had a populist message to Russians that while their children were dying and their husbands dying in Ukraine, the children of the elite were in the south of France enjoying themselves. So there was plenty of challenge there. And Putin, in that brief extract that we saw from his television appearance on the day of the coup, was certainly very angered by it. It may also be, and I think if indeed it was an assassination and the plane was shot down by Russian air defenses, and we don't know that yet, that's the speculation, it's also really to try and deter other people in the elite, in the military from challenging Putin again, just making them understand what will happen to them if they do.
Candace, what about that? If this was an assassination of some kind, how would that be received and perceived in Russia? What's the message that's meant to send?
Well, the message is, mess around and you'll find out, basically. I think the timing is interesting. We heard just recently that Sergei Surovikin, General Armageddon as he's known, a big backer of Prigozhin for a very long time since their days together in Syria. He apparently was demoted, has been under house arrest. There are still other shoes, I think, left to drop in terms of the retribution inside the military. A number of different commanders there who probably will be, I think, dealt with or are being dealt with. So that's going to be really key to watch. But in terms of what we're hearing out of places like Belarus, where we know there are some Wagner contingents still operating, we see that there are reports of the internet being cut off, cell phones also being cut off in that area. And so that suggests, in fact, that there is some concern in the Kremlin that there could be some sort of retribution or some sort of operational sort of revenge plan that Prigozhin had in place in case of death.
Okay, so what can we say about this? I would be a little more definitive that, yeah, Putin is most likely behind the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, and there's pretty easily identified reasons for this. Prigozhin crossed the red line with the coup attempt, and so once he did that, Putin really couldn't continue to rule the system the way he does with Prigozhin alive, or at least being so public as he was following that mutiny in terms of social media posts and kind of presenting himself as just continuing to operate as usual. That just couldn't occur. It makes Putin look too weak. And so that's the first point, is that he had plenty of reasons to want to need Prigozhin dead. He did it and if this wasn't an assassination, it was a very public and kind of dramatic one. He didn't just, usually he has eliminated foes through poisonings. This, by blowing a jet out of the sky, kind of demonstrates a new level of violence that would give a lot of elites pause. And so the other thing to note here, and we didn't really have any clips that captured this, is Prigozhin was a particularly unique and vocal critic of the war in Ukraine. And especially during the coup attempt, he laid out an argument against the war of Ukraine in which he said that the original justification of the war in Ukraine, that Ukraine presented some sort of existential threat to Russia, was a farce and inaccurate. And so in that sort of kind of vocal criticism of the Ukraine war and this ongoing critique of how Russia is and its military leaders fought the war, you had a person who's identified not with some sort of liberal or progressive identity, but rather an ultranationalist that used very violent means to get results in the Ukraine war, critiquing the war and even the foundations on this war. And so that also could not be allowed to stand by Vladimir Putin. And then finally, the thing that a lot of commentators are seizing on is that this sends a signal to anybody else who dares to oppose or voice any sort of criticisms of the war effort. And what's really interesting here about the death of Prigozhin is, again, this idea that this could be a wider clampdown on not the progressive critics of the war in Russia. They've already pretty much handled those opposition figures, right? And that segment of the population, they've all left Russia now or have been driven underground. The ultra-nationalist right that Prigozhin was one of the best representatives of and then the most well-known, they still had a lot of sway and felt pretty emboldened to critique the war effort as insufficient, inefficient. They publicized a lot of mistakes by the Russian military. Now it shows that not only was Prigozhin killed, but his second lieutenant was killed in that same plane crash. And a general, Surovikin, was recently, I think it was announced today, removed from all of his positions in leadership of the Russian military, and he was a key ally of Prigozhin, that this could signal a wider clampdown on the right-wing opposition to Putin's conduct of the war. And so he's solidifying power here.
Okay, so Vladimir Putin has likely ordered the killing of his most prominent ally to maintain his iron grip on Russia. By all indications, Putin plans to continue fighting the war in Ukraine. So let's take a look at the state of the war by examining Ukraine's most recent strategic move, a counteroffensive to retake territory held by Russia in the south and east of Ukraine. We're going to start with an audio clip from the New York Times The Daily podcast. And so go ahead and run that clip.
So at that point, did you get a sense of what the strategy was here, what the Ukrainian government's plan actually was?
It started to come into focus when we look at a map of the south of Ukraine and we see where the military was attacking. They were hitting at areas of the front line that face south toward the Sea of Azov. The Ukrainian strategy in the counteroffensive is to strike south and drive a wedge through Russian-occupied territory, dividing the Russian zone into two halves and cutting rail and road lines that connect Russia with the Crimean Peninsula. The idea of this strategy is a theory of victory that would cut logistical supplies to the Crimean Peninsula and also to everything west of where they drive this wedge through the Russian territory, which would probably force a retreat of Russian forces to the west of the counteroffensive. It's a theory of a step toward victory that involves crossing about 60 miles of very flat terrain from where the front line had been 3 weeks ago to the Sea of Azov.
Okay, so this counteroffensive had been highly anticipated for strategic and political reasons. Strategically, Ukraine wants to achieve a military breakthrough to avoid a stalemate that locks in territorial gains for Russia in the east and the south of Ukraine. A stalemate of the current conflict favors Russia because the longer that Russia holds Ukrainian territory, the harder it will be to reverse those facts on the ground. Moreover, a ceasefire under current conditions could produce a frozen conflict in which Russia simply uses a halt in armed combat to rebuild its forces and then goes ahead and launches a fresh military attack in the future. Politically, Ukraine needs to show progress to continue Western aid. Western democratic governments must show their voting publics that the billions of dollars of military aid are producing results, or they might not have the public support to keep those weapons flows going into Ukraine. Consequently, a lot is riding on this counteroffensive by Ukraine, aimed primarily in the south of Ukraine. The strategy relies on breaking through Russian defenses in the southern land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia. If Ukrainian forces can reclaim the territory that connects Russia with Crimea, it can cut off essential supply lines and then isolate Russian military forces. These military forces might then retreat, leading to a larger recapture of Ukrainian territory in the south.
Right, and so that's the strategy. Now, breaking through the Russian defenses is the key problem here. It's easier said than done. And so we're going to take a look briefly here at the obstacles facing Ukraine and this counteroffensive strategy. And so we're going to listen to another clip by the same daily podcast that concentrates on these challenges. So let's run that clip now.
Well, what lies in front of them are farm fields as far as the eye can see. Very flat, open terrain, militarily extremely difficult to cross, almost impossible to find cover for armored vehicles or for troops in the open. And the most difficult part is the first part. The Russians have had months to prepare a very dense defensive line, which is about 10 miles deep. And this is minefields, concrete barriers for tanks, ditches that would trap armored vehicles, bunkers, and trench lines for infantry. And this is really a kill zone the Russians have set up for the Ukrainian army that is really intended to inflict as much damage on the Ukrainian army as possible.
So the first goal is to breach this 10-mile strip of Russian defenses, this kill zone. What's the tactical plan to breach that?
Well, in each location, it's a little bit different. And one commander I spoke with compared this to a game of chess, where out on these open fields, there's sort of a checkerboard, tree lines and fields, and both sides can see almost everything that the enemy is doing with their drones, with satellites, with surveillance by soldiers on the ground. So the strategy is to find areas that might be a little bit weaker than elsewhere. In one location, for example, the Ukrainians attacked along a small meandering river, the Mokry-Yali River, where there are 6 or 7 villages all in a line. And by hopping from village to village, the Ukrainians could find cover in abandoned houses and move their equipment and their infantry forward into this area.
So it's like they're trying to push through this Russian defense line. It's almost like they're pushing against the wall, trying with their hands in different places and identify the weakest spot.
Exactly. That's what's happening now. They're probing, they're looking for a weakness in the Russian defensive line. And right now they're doing this with only a small portion of the soldiers who have been specifically trained and equipped for the counteroffensive. Only 3 of 12 brigades that will eventually take part in this military action are now probing and fighting along the front line. And presumably, when a weak spot is found, those who are in reserve will come rushing forward in a major battle to break through the Russian defenses and then flow into southern Ukraine and advance toward the sea. And it looks like it'll be a very difficult and grueling battle once all 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers are engaged in the fight. At that point, it could be the largest land battle in Europe since World War II.
Okay, so to kind of answer the question, why has the counteroffensive been so slow? There's a few main points here, and one is that it was always going to be hard and slow and have a high casualty rate because of a few crucial factors. One is that Russia had a lot of time to build very formidable and elaborate defense lines with trenches and minefields and other ways to slow down and halt a counteroffensive, even with the high-tech Western tanks and other military aid that has been coming from the United States, Germany, and its Western allies. And so this sort of these defense lines created, as the podcast points out, a sort of kill zone in which Ukrainian casualties are going to be really high, and it's going to be really hard to get any sort of significant territorial gains. And the second big point then, besides Russia's adapted and had time to defend itself, is that the offense is harder than defense in this military conflict. That Ukraine did the same thing when Russia was trying to achieve a large-scale territorial advantage by playing effective defense, and it was able to, with less troops and good defense, to hold back Russia. Well, now Ukraine is trying to push out Russian forces. And when you're trying to do that, what most military analysts say is you need a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to succeed in defeating dug-in defensive military units. And Ukraine simply doesn't have that. And finally, what some critics of Western military aid point out is that Ukraine never achieved any sort of air superiority over its own airspace to conduct a military operation like that. And President Zelensky of Ukraine has been talking and asking for these sorts of fighter jets and other equipment to provide that. But without that air superiority, what some critics have, or some commentators have said, is that no Western military would ever have tried to engage in a military operation like this without first establishing air superiority. And so those are the reasons why things are going so slowly. And the final point that we want to make before closing this section is that this turn of events of a kind of bogged down counteroffensive has created some questions and problems for the United States and its allies. And some sort of strategic achievement would be very helpful, perhaps even necessary, for the West to have the kind of public support to continue this military aid. And so we're going to show one last clip here from CNN this time on U.S. strategic thinking surrounding Ukraine's slow progress. And there's been some news stories here that have seized on U.S. intelligence assessments that say that Ukraine is unlikely to achieve its strategic goals by winter, when fighting is going to slow down because of weather conditions. And so if that happens, what is the United States and the West going to do next? And so let's go ahead and run that clip now.
You know, this new reporting from our Katie Bo-Lillis that American officials are concerned about the strategy in Ukraine, where they're focusing this emphasis on Crimea. And we're learning that, of course, some American officials are not happy about it. What are your thoughts on this strategically?
Yeah, I think Katie Bo's reporting is spot on. It's a little bit critical to say that it might stall, that it might not be successful. That's a truthful assessment, or at least there's an element of truth within that, and there's some concern. The thing that the Ukrainians are doing right now is they are expending intellectual firepower, and they're expending firepower on objectives that are not directly attributing, or at least contributing, to the success of trying to isolate Russian forces. And then as a result of that isolation, you then must reduce those forces. When you go after targets in Crimea, they've also taken shots into Moscow a couple weeks ago. Those are distractions. What needs to take place is all of those weapon systems, all of that planning, all of the direction that the Ukrainians need to take right now needs to be on one or two very specific objectives, so that they can achieve some immediate tactical success and then exploit that success. When you start throwing firepower in the direction of Moscow and then deep into Crimea, you're not going to achieve that.
So why is Ukraine's counteroffensive so slow going so far? I mean, 2 months in, and there hasn't been any major breakthroughs at this point. I mean, what's the biggest concern?
Well, look, the Russians are in a defensive posture. Attacks against defensive positions require a 3-to-1 advantage. I would suggest the Ukrainians probably don't have that 3-to-1 advantage in terms of the attack. And also, the Russians have been digging in over the course of the previous 5 months before the offensive began, which means they have defense in depth. They have positions that support positions. They have fire that crosses each other, which means they've laid a ton of mines, makes it very, very slow going. This is an incredible tough task on the part of the Ukrainians. That's why, frankly, when you look at the strikes in Crimea, you get the sense that they are trying to throw some haymakers, that wild left punch. That's not going to achieve success. What's going to achieve success is continued tactical penetration of those defensive belts so that you can isolate those forces. Once a military unit is isolated, they're incredibly vulnerable. That's what Ukraine needs to try to achieve. And I would say one more thing, Amra, that what the Ukrainians are doing now looks not dissimilar to what the Russians did when they invaded in February. The Russians got way over their skis, multiple axes of approach, and the Ukrainians very, very quickly were able to stop them and then to push the Russians back. I'd hate to say it, but it looks like the Ukrainians might have failed to learn that lesson.
So we're going to close on a pretty pessimistic note here that, U.S. intelligence and Western, there were other Western officials from Great Britain in particular that have also kind of raised some questions about the strategy that Ukraine is using and whether they're going to be able to get that sort of breakthrough that everyone was hoping to achieve in this counter-offensive. And there's going to be a lot of discussion if that doesn't happen in the, before winter sets in, which is they don't have a whole lot of time, a couple months at best, before the ground gets too wet and soggy to run tanks over. And so I think that there'll be another discussion here and another, important juncture in this conflict to see what the West is prepared to do to continue to support Ukraine in what looks like a stalemated conflict. Not good.
No, not good. But again, this issue is going to be in the backdrop of a lot of what we're talking about this semester. It's going to be important to the election. We're going to see separation in Republican candidates. We're going to see different grand strategy visions that emerge among the Republican candidates, and these different grand strategies are going to be talked about in the context of this conflict.
Right. Exactly.
As we were listening, I jotted down some notes, and we can see also when you read the West Point speech, which will be next week, and Barack Obama's vision for the world in, that was 2014. Yeah. Remember who his vice president was, and think about how the war is being fought in Ukraine right now.
That was Joe Biden.
Yes. But you can see continuity in the Obama and the Biden approach, and in many ways, the way that the U.S. has participated in the conflict in Ukraine represents what Obama was trying to reorient American grand strategy to do in the final stages of his term. Find local allies that do the brunt of the fighting, and the U.S. is going to give technical aid, technological aid, and tons of money. And this has defined U.S. participation in this conflict.
Exactly.
So, all right, have a good week. Keep shooting emails and questions about course content to us. Otherwise, we will see you again in 2 weeks.